December 8th, 1940. Winston Churchill sits down and writes a 15-page letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. Britain has been fighting Nazi Germany alone for over a year. France has fallen. The British Army barely escaped at Dunkirk. The Luftwaffe is bombing London nightly during the Blitz. And now Britain is running out of money. Churchill writes, "The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. This letter will change everything." Within 3 months, America will pass the Lend-Lease Act. Over the next 4 years, $31 billion worth of American supplies will flow to Britain. That's $430 billion in today's money. Planes, tanks, ships, food, oil, steel, everything needed to fight a modern war. Without it, Britain would have collapsed. Churchill will call it the most unsordid act in history. But there was a price, a hidden price that wasn't measured in dollars. America demanded something in return, something that would dismantle the British Empire's economic system, something that would make Britain permanently dependent on American power. This is the story of how $31 billion in aid transformed the relationship between two nations and changed the balance of global power forever. Let's start with why Britain needed help in the first place. When war broke out in September 1939, Britain had wealth. The empire controlled a quarter of the world's land and population. British citizens owned investments across the globe. American stocks, South American railroads, Asian plantations. These investments generated income. London was the center of world finance. The pound sterling was a global currency almost as trusted as gold, but war is expensive, unimaginably expensive. Britain had to buy everything. Rifles, bullets, bombs, planes, tanks, ships, steel, oil, chemicals, food, everything. British factories were running full speed, but they couldn't produce enough. America had the industrial capacity Britain needed. American factories could make weapons faster and cheaper than anyone else, so Britain placed massive orders. At first, Britain could pay. The Neutrality Acts, American laws passed in the 1930s to keep America out of war, said Britain could only buy on a cash and carry basis. Cash meant gold or US dollars. Carry meant Britain had to transport the goods on British ships. No credit, no loans, cash only. Britain paid with gold. Ships carrying thousands of tons of gold bullion crossed the Atlantic to New York. In December 1939 alone, Britain sent $300 million in gold to American vaults. That's $6.5 billion in today's money, shipped in 1 month. The gold was counted bar by bar and locked in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Britain also sold investments. The government forced British citizens to hand over their American securities. Stocks, bonds, anything denominated in US dollars. The government seized them under emergency powers. This wasn't voluntary. Citizens were paid in pounds. Then the government sold the securities in New York for dollars and used those dollars to buy American supplies. Over $820 million worth of British-owned American securities were sold. That's over $15 billion today. British families lost wealth built up over generations, all to buy tanks and bullets. By late 1940, Britain's money was running out. Gold reserves were nearly empty. Dollar reserves were almost gone. The orders Britain had placed with American factories were massive, billions of dollars worth of weapons and supplies. But Britain couldn't pay for them. This terrified Churchill. If Britain couldn't buy American supplies, Britain would lose the war. Germany would conquer Europe. Hitler would control everything from the Atlantic to the Urals. America would face Nazi Germany alone. Churchill knew Roosevelt understood this. Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but American law prevented it, and American politics made it nearly impossible. Most Americans opposed entering the war. Congress wouldn't approve loans to Britain because Britain still owed money from World War I. During the Great Depression, Britain had defaulted on those debts. Lending more money seemed foolish. Roosevelt needed a solution that helped Britain without looking like America was giving away money or entering the war. On December 16, 1940, Roosevelt held a press conference. He introduced a new idea. Instead of selling weapons to Britain, America would lend them. Roosevelt used a simple analogy. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire and I have a length of garden hose. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. Now what do? I don't say to him before that operation, "Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it." I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. The American people understood this. You don't charge your neighbor to borrow a hose during a fire. You lend it. After the fire, he returns it or replaces it. This was brilliant politics. Roosevelt wasn't proposing loans or gifts. He was proposing to lend equipment. The equipment would either be returned after the war or paid for later. Congress could accept this. The American people could accept this. On December 29, 1940, Roosevelt gave a fireside chat radio address. He said America must become the arsenal of democracy. We must have more ships, more guns, more planes, more of everything, and then we must be able to help Britain. On March 11, 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. The vote wasn't close. The House approved it 317 to 71. The Senate approved it 60 to 31. The act gave Roosevelt enormous power. He could lend, lease, sell, or give defense articles to any country whose defense he believed vital to American security. No payment required up front. The goods would be either returned after the war or paid for under terms the president decided. Roosevelt signed it into law immediately. Britain was declared eligible that same day. Supplies began flowing almost immediately, but slowly at first. American factories were still tooling up for war production. The first shipments were mostly food: dried eggs, evaporated milk, lard, bacon, cheese, canned meat. By early 1941, American foodstuffs were arriving in Britain. Then came the weapons. In March 1941, only about 100 planes were sent under Lend-Lease. The rest of the 2,400 planes Britain received that period were still being paid for with British cash. But by mid-1941, the flow increased. By late 1941, after Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, Lend-Lease became a flood. Let me show you what Britain received. The total value of Lend-Lease aid to Britain was $31.4 billion in today's money. That's $430 billion. About 63% of all Lend-Lease aid went to Britain and the British Commonwealth. This wasn't just weapons. It was everything. Aircraft. America sent tens of thousands of planes, fighters, bombers, transport planes. By 1943 to 1944, about 25% of all aircraft used by Britain came through Lend-Lease. Tanks and combat vehicles, thousands of tanks, armored cars, and military vehicles. By 1944, about 41% of all tanks rolling off American assembly lines went to Lend-Lease countries. Britain got a huge share. Trucks and vehicles. This was critical. Modern war requires mobility. Soldiers need transport. Supplies need trucks. America sent hundreds of thousands of trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles. Ships. America built over 200 merchant ships for Britain under Lend-Lease. These replaced ships sunk by German U-boats. America also repaired British warships in American shipyards so they could return to battle faster. Food. Massive quantities of food kept Britain fed. Without American food shipments, Britain would have faced starvation. The German U-boat campaign was sinking supply ships. American food made up the difference. Millions of tons of flour, meat, eggs, milk, cheese, and vegetables. Petroleum. Oil and gasoline for planes, tanks, ships, and trucks. Without American oil, British forces couldn't move. Industrial supplies. Steel, aluminum, copper, chemicals, machine tools. Everything needed to keep British factories running and producing weapons. The scale was staggering. In 1943 to 1944, when the war reached its peak, about a quarter of all British war supplies came through Lend-Lease. British forces in North Africa, Italy, and France were using American weapons. The Royal Air Force was flying American bombers and fighters. British soldiers were driving American trucks. British ships were burning American fuel. Without Lend-Lease, Britain couldn't have continued fighting. The program saved Britain from collapse, but it came with conditions that weren't widely discussed at the time, conditions that would reshape the post-war world. These conditions were spelled out in Article 7 of the Master Lend-Lease Agreement signed in February 1942. This article was about more than military aid. It was about the future of the world economy. Article 7 said the final settlement for Lend-Lease aid must include agreed action by the United States, and Britain directed to the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce and to the reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers. Those words sound boring, technical, but they weren't. They were explosive. What did discriminatory treatment mean? It meant imperial preference. Imperial preference was the system where Britain gave trade advantages to colonies and dominions. Under this system, goods from Canada, Australia, India, and other parts of the British Empire entered Britain with lower tariffs than goods from other countries. British goods got the same preferential treatment entering empire markets. The system had been formalized in 1932 under the Ottawa Agreements. The motto was home producers first, empire producers second, foreign producers last. It created a closed trading bloc. The British Empire traded mostly with itself. American goods faced higher tariffs when competing with empire goods. American officials, especially Secretary of State Cordell Hull, hated imperial preference. Hull called it the greatest injury in a commercial way that has been inflicted on this country since I have been in public life. He blamed imperial preference for hurting American exports. He blamed it for worsening the Great Depression. Hull wanted imperial preference dismantled. And now, with Britain desperate for American aid, Hull had leverage. In June 1941, John Maynard Keynes, Britain's greatest economist, was sent to Washington to negotiate the terms of Lend-Lease. Assistant Secretary of State Dean Acheson presented Keynes with a draft agreement. When Keynes read Article 7, he exploded. He called it lunatic proposals. Keynes argued that Britain couldn't agree to eliminate imperial preference and trade controls. Not while the war was still going on. Not when Britain's post-war economic situation was completely unknown. He said the language was too rigid. It didn't account for the reality that Britain would need controls after the war to manage its balance of payments. The arguments went on for months. Churchill himself was torn. Churchill had been a supporter of free trade his entire life. In 1903, he'd left the Conservative Party over the issue of imperial preference. But as wartime leader of a coalition government, Churchill couldn't take a strong stand. The Conservative faction, in his government, led by Leopold Amory, strongly supported imperial preference. They saw it as vital to keeping the empire together. They threatened to revolt and bring down the government if Churchill agreed to dismantle it. Roosevelt tried to reassure Churchill. In a phone call, Roosevelt told Churchill that Article 7 didn't mean Britain had to immediately eliminate imperial preference. It just meant they had to work toward that goal. The language was deliberately vague. Both sides could interpret it differently. Churchill accepted this. On February 23, 1942, the Master Lend-Lease Agreement was signed. Article 7 became official. But here's what nobody told the British people. Article 7 was the price of Lend-Lease. America wasn't just helping Britain out of generosity. America was using Britain's desperate need to reshape the world trading system in America's favor. Some historians call this America's economic war aims. While the war was about defeating Hitler militarily, it was also about who would dominate the post-war world economy. And America intended to dominate. The State Department saw this clearly. They believed that if imperial preference remained after the war, Britain would recover as America's economic rival. A closed British Empire trading bloc would shut American goods out of a quarter of the world as markets. That couldn't be allowed. Article 7 was designed to prevent it. In practice, Article 7 meant Britain had to accept American leadership in creating the post-war economic order. This included the Bretton Woods system, which made the U.S. dollar the world's reserve currency instead of the pound sterling. It included the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which reduced tariffs globally, and it included the gradual dismantling of imperial preference. But there were other hidden costs. Lend-Lease required Britain to open its books. American Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau demanded full access to Britain's financial records. America wanted to verify Britain was truly broke before providing aid. Britain had to prove it was poor. This was humiliating. The world's greatest empire had to show its accounts to a former colony and beg for help. The British complied. They had no choice. Morgenthau's team examined everything: British gold reserves, dollar reserves, overseas investments, government finances, everything. They confirmed Britain was nearly bankrupt. Lend-Lease also required Britain to liquidate remaining assets before America provided more aid. The most famous example was American Vice Coast Corporation. This was a major British-owned company in America that made synthetic textiles. In early 1941, Roosevelt demanded Britain sell it. The sale wasn't about money. It was about proving Britain had exhausted all alternatives before asking for American help. Britain sold American Vice Coast in March 1941 for a fraction of its real value. It was a fire sale. The proceeds went to buy more war supplies. Another condition was reverse Lend-Lease. Britain had to provide goods and services to American forces stationed in Britain. This included food, housing, transportation, airfields, ports, and military facilities. Britain also provided weapons. American pilots flew British Spitfire fighters. The value of reverse Lend-Lease from Britain to America totaled nearly $7 billion. That's about $97 billion today. This offset some of the cost of American aid, but it also meant Britain was supporting American forces at British expense while fighting for survival. The most important hidden cost was dependence. Before the war, Britain was economically independent. Britain had its own industrial base. Britain had overseas investments generating income. Britain controlled global trade through the empire. After Lend-Lease, all of that changed. British industry became dependent on American supplies. British forces couldn't fight without American weapons. The British economy couldn't function without American oil, steel, and food. This dependence didn't end when the war ended. It became permanent. Let's fast forward to August 21st, 1945. Japan has just surrendered. World War II is over. Americans are celebrating. And President Truman makes an announcement that shocks Britain. Lend-Lease is terminated immediately. No warning. No transition period. Overnight, the flow of supplies stops. This is devastating. The British economy is still on a war footing. Factories are making weapons, not consumer goods. Exports have collapsed to 30% of pre-war levels. Britain is importing food and materials, but can't export enough to pay for them. Lend-Lease had filled that gap. Now the gap is gone. Large shipments of supplies are in transit or sitting in British warehouses. Britain needs them. The population needs food. Factories need raw materials. But now Britain has to pay for them. America offers a deal. Britain can keep the supplies in transit for 10 cents on the dollar. That's $1.75 billion. Over $15 billion in today's money. Where will Britain get the money? Britain is broke. This forces Britain to negotiate a massive loan. John Maynard Keynes is sent to Washington. He's 62 years old and in poor health. He hopes America will provide a grant, or at least an interest-free loan. After all, Britain fought Hitler for 2 years alone before America entered the war. Britain sacrificed everything. Surely America owes Britain help as a moral obligation. The American negotiators disagree. They offer a commercial loan with interest. Negotiations drag on for 3 months. They're brutal. Finally, in December 1945, terms are settled. America will loan Britain $3.75 billion. Canada adds $1.19 billion, total of $4.94 billion, about $80 billion today. The interest rate is 2%. Repayment over 50 years, starting in 1950. These terms seem reasonable. But there are conditions. Britain must make the pound sterling convertible into dollars within 1 year. That means countries holding pounds can exchange them for dollars. This will drain Britain's dollar reserves. Britain must dismantle imperial preference. Empire trade advantages must end. Britain must support American plans for the post-war economic order, including Bretton Woods. British politicians hate the terms. Many see it as America exploiting Britain's weakness. But Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin argues Britain has no choice. Without the loan, Britain would have to abandon military commitments. Living standards would collapse. The new Labour government's plans for a welfare state would be impossible. Parliament approves the loan reluctantly. The House of Commons votes 343 to 100. But the resentment is real. Britain has been forced into economic dependence on America. The loan helps Britain survive, but the convertibility requirement proves disastrous. On July 15, 1947, Britain makes the pound convertible. Within weeks, disaster strikes. Countries with sterling rush to exchange pounds for dollars. India, Egypt, and others want dollars to buy American goods. Within 5 weeks, nearly $1 billion flows out of Britain's reserves. Britain can't sustain it. On August 20th, 1947, convertibility is suspended. It lasted 5 weeks. The humiliation is complete. The loan becomes a burden Britain carries for 60 years. Britain defers payments 6 times. In 1956, 1957, 1964, 1965, 1968, and 1976. Each time, Britain claims exchange rates make payment impractical. Finally, on December 29, 2006, Britain makes the final payment, $83 million to America and $23.6 million to Canada. Britain has finished paying for World War II, 61 years after the war ended. But the real cost wasn't the money, it was power. The Lend-Lease program and the 1945 loan marked the moment America replaced Britain as the world's economic leader. Before the war, London was the center of global finance. The pound was the world's reserve currency. British banks dominated international lending. After Lend-Lease and the loan, everything changed. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. New York replaced London as the financial capital. American corporations dominated global markets. American banks controlled international lending. The British Empire fell apart. Not immediately, but steadily. Britain couldn't afford to maintain colonies after the war. India gained independence in 1947. Palestine was given up in 1948. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, colony after colony became independent. By 1997, when Hong Kong was returned to China, the empire was finished. Imperial preference was dismantled as America demanded. The Ottawa Agreements were abandoned. Empire trade advantages ended. The closed trading bloc was open to American goods. American exports flooded into former empire markets. Britain became a junior partner to America. The special relationship Churchill spoke of was really a relationship between unequals. America led, Britain followed. This dependence continues today. Britain's economy is tied to America's. British defense depends on American military support. British foreign policy follows American leadership. The seeds of this were planted in 1941 when Britain accepted Lend-Lease. Here's the brutal lesson. There's no such thing as free aid between nations. When one country provides massive assistance to another, the donor gains power over the recipient. The recipient becomes dependent. America used Lend-Lease brilliantly. It saved Britain from collapse. That was genuine. Without American aid, Britain would have lost the war. But America also used Britain's desperation to reshape the world economy. Article 7 dismantled imperial preference. The 1945 loan forced sterling convertibility. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate policy. American officials knew exactly what they were doing. They were using aid to transfer economic power from Britain to America. And it worked. By 1950, America was the undisputed economic superpower. The dollar was supreme. American corporations dominated. American banks controlled international finance. Britain had won the war militarily, but economically, Britain had lost its position at the top. The empire was dying. The pound was weak. Britain was dependent on American support. Churchill understood this. In private, he called the 1945 loan terms harsh. He felt America had extracted too much, but Churchill also knew Britain had no alternative. Without American aid, Britain would have lost everything. Better to accept dependence than defeat. The question is whether Britain could have negotiated better terms. Probably not. America held all the leverage. Britain was desperate. Desperate countries don't get good terms, they get survival. And survival was worth accepting dependence. But make no mistake, the price was real. Lend-Lease wasn't charity, it was an investment. America invested $31 billion in defeating Hitler. But America also invested in replacing Britain as the world's dominant power. That investment paid off spectacularly. By 1950, the American century had begun. It started with a garden hose analogy and a 15-page letter from Churchill to Roosevelt. It ended with Britain as a junior partner, the empire dismantled, and America supreme. The $31 billion lifeline saved Britain. But it also transformed the relationship between two nations forever. That's the hidden cost nobody talked about in 1941. That's the price Britain paid for survival.